Well, let's get started. Good day, mate. So is that what they say in down under? Good day, mate. Very good. All right, we're hitting part 2 today, but more on that in just a moment. Part 2 of federalism. Open book quiz. 4 things you have to do before you take your quiz, though. Read chapter 5 in the book. That's the next chapter. Now, here you have provisions in the Constitution to read and outline, but this week you'd better do that before you take the quiz because there's questions on the quiz regarding that, so make sure you do that. You see the read about how laws are made, and then you've got a tiny URL there. You plug that in, that'll take you to it. It's brief, but read that on how laws are made. There's also questions on the quiz regarding that, and a passage from Exodus 5, 1 through 21. It's not a lot, really, but it's. I just wanted to point out it's done before you take the quiz, and then kind of looking long range over the next 2 weeks. In other words, this is not due next week, but if you want to get it out of the way, view the Section 6 video, the American Presidency number 2. Now, I know that sounds crazy to see the number 2 before you see number 1, but hey, you know, we do things a little crazy around here. So you're going to want to see that. Be just keeping you on your toes. That's right. Over the next 2 weeks, it'll actually be due. Pictures, Julia, do you want to put your email address in there again? And how many pictures did you get? One person told me they just sent it to you before the start of class. You've only gotten 2. Okay, folks, we got to do better than this. You're better than that. All right, so, you know, I hate to advise you to do it while you're, you know, right now over the next hour and a half, you know, while you're in class, but do it right away afterwards. Were you in class last week, Brooks? What are the pictures for? Oh, that would explain why. Okay, well then you haven't seen the video yet. Ha ha ha! All right, well watch the video. It's all explained in there. Basically, you're meeting your classmates as it points out there. So you send that to Julia, and did Julia put her, she didn't put her email address in there. So, okay, so do it today. Memorization, keep practicing Romans 13. You say something real quick. Is that even possible, Julia? I mean, honestly. All right. Well, I'll just cut you off if it goes beyond real quick. Whoops, sorry about that, Jaylene. Did the wrong person. All right, Julia, go ahead, real quick.
Hello. Okay, yeah, this was a question for you as well as something just to say to the other kids in class, which I CC'd you on my email to Harrison about this when he was one of the 2 or 3 that actually sent me a picture. But on the PowerPoint slides, I was wondering as well, just so it wasn't one picture per slide or anything like that with nothing else on it, with your permission, would it be okay if I put other information as well, like age or grade or things like that? Like maybe your age, your grade, and like a fact about yourself or something like that. Because I know we'll be introducing ourselves on mic, but that would actually be something on the
Okay, no, just clarification.
Well.
We probably won't have time for everybody to speak. So yeah, if everybody wants to send your age, your grade, and some interesting fact about you to Julia, she could put that in, and that'd be great. And Julia, why don't you put in your email address again? And any other questions like that, go ahead and email me. Sorry, I know just today we're real hard pressed for time, so I got to keep this moving. But again, everybody, there's the email, so please send it to Julia. The midterm test is coming soon, so in 2 weeks we will be preparing for that. Okay. So anyway, that's long term. All right, any questions on the homework? Not a problem. Not a problem. All right, opening question for the day. Yeah, I understood what you meant. What's the theme that runs through the Constitution? We talked about this last week, so we won't expect Brooks to get this since Brooks wasn't in class. State sovereignty, federalism, the states, the states, the states. Well, these are examples of the theme that flesh out the theme, but it's not necessarily the theme. Checks and balances, okay, you're getting closer. Again, checks and balances are maybe a reason, explain the reason why for our theme. The voice of the people, okay, not bad. Probably of all the answers, maybe checks and balances gets closest to it, but really everything you guys have said, and there we go. I think Harrison actually now took the number one spot. Yeah, the concept of limiting power, and since the federal Constitution limits the power of the federal government, or basically stipulates the powers and limits their powers, yeah, we're talking about limiting the power of government officials, specifically limiting the federal government. This is the theme that runs through the Constitution, and here's the reason. It is and by the way, everything you guys was saying was, you know, federalism, checks and balances, voice of the people. I mean, all those are ways of limiting it, but it's really important to do this. And you'll notice that today, politicians don't appreciate this fact because they want to consolidate power. They want to do more things without checks and balances. But our founders understood it's dangerous to put tremendous power in the hands of one person or in the hands of one group of people. So their thinking, the founders' thinking, was that we need to have checks and balances and things like that, where people can have their actions reviewed, their actions canceled out by others. And you may have noticed in the book there was an early saying in our country. Do you all remember what it was? Fill in the missing blank. The blank of government is the true liberty and freedom of the people. What's the missing word? Gold star for the day for anybody who noticed this in the book. The blank of government. Confinement. That's a good synonym, perhaps. Limiting is another good, but that's not the technical phrase. The phrase was the restraint of government. What's the first letter? The restraint of government. This is a common American 18th century saying. Now, why would they write this theme into the Constitution? What view of man leads to this view? That you need to restrain the power of government. A realistic one for sure. Yeah, the S word. The fact that men are inherently sinful, right? Man is a sinner, for all have sinned. So one way of limiting that power of government is through the check and balance known as federalism. Now, you know, we've talked about what it means to have a republic, how that's a check and balance. And so now we're talking about federalism. Later we'll be talking about separation of powers in future classes. But how does federalism, since we're on that, we started this last week, how does federalism limit the power of federal officials? How does federalism do that? How does federalism limit the power of government officials? And I don't know that this picture necessarily helps you answer the question. It's just kind of a cool picture. So if you're looking at it, try to decipher it. Okay, providing a check and balance of federal power and state power. So yeah, the fact that all the power is not at the top, Hannah then says by giving the states a majority of power. So Yeah, so the states have a lot of power, and let's face it, if one state passes an oppressive law, like the state of Maryland, where they infamously passed a rain tax, which I'm not even sure I understand, but I love that concept. A rain tax, so the more it rains, the more you get taxed. It was something like that. So if one state does something really dumb, you can move out of that state. Okay? Each of the states are laboratories for policy experiments. But if the federal government or the national government passes oppressive laws, then where do you go? If all the power is at the top, oppressive, then you've got to leave the country. That's dumb, or a more freedom-loving state. Julia says it makes it an upside triangle, kind of like the nutrition chart with people on the top, states in the middle, feds on the bottom. Good. Now, in regard to federalism, we're going to be talking about where the rubber meets the road today. And we kind of broached this last week, but we're going to look at more examples. You'll really see why federalism is so important. But what we're talking about today is something that most students in America are not taught anymore. If they do know their history, they probably don't agree with what our founders did. And that's why it's really important to look at this and see what the Bible has to say about this. So we're going to begin studying today. What we're going to begin studying today and what you read in chapter 4 is something that each of you, I hope, will always remember. I mentioned this last week, especially if you ever plan to run for office in your state or county government. It didn't seem like many of you were interested in that. But even if you don't become a state leader, you should know these truths in order to teach others, especially if those others are people like your state delegate or governor, because, let's face it, they will come, as I was telling you last week, they'll come to your door asking for your vote. I promise you, before you die, that will probably happen. Or you might write letters to your representatives at some point, or go attend a hearing, of some kind. But, your state legislators need to be reminded of the important truths that our founding fathers believed. They need to be reminded of how much power they have. And so do your friends, by the way. I mean, each of you has a circle of influence. You have friends and family members that you will influence as you talk to them. And not just talking to them in person, they may read articles that you post on Facebook, right? You have friends, right? Yeah, not during school you don't. It's all study, 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 right? But, it's a great idea to post some good articles on your Facebook page, help educate your friends. I mean, start some great discussions. I mean, there's many ways that you can have an impact. So with that said, as we look at this set of principles, last week you read about the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, what were the Alien and Sedition Acts? And just so you know, this has nothing to do with little green men in Roswell, New Mexico. Okay, we're not talking about those kind of aliens, if any of you are into that. Sorry, that's not what we're talking about here. The sedition of aliens, there you go. Anybody want to take the mic to explain this briefly? They were acts, okay, here we go, that seek to suppress the dissension. Yeah, that's exactly what it was. They were trying to quiet or quell opposition to, prevent criticism of government officials. And so these laws were designed to punish people who opposed the Federalist Party and who supported the Democrat-Republican Party. Back then, the Democrat-Republican Party was all one party. And so there were newspaper writers who were imprisoned for criticizing the government. You had aliens who were deported, that is, non-citizens. In the second semester of our government class, you're going to see at least one famous person who was incarcerated because of this law. But in opposition to this law, what two states objected? What were the two states? And I live in one of them. Woohoo! Proud of them. Yep, Virginia and Kentucky. Yeah, both southern states. Who wrote for Kentucky? Who wrote for Virginia? Some of our more famous founding fathers. Jefferson wrote for Kentucky. There we go. And Madison for Virginia. Good. Yeah, there you go. And both of them together said that a state could veto or cancel an unconstitutional law passed by Congress. They said states can veto unconstitutional laws within their borders. So essentially, a state could say, this congressional law is not a law in this state. Now, in your homework, you saw that they used different words than veto. I mean, they didn't use the V word. What were the two words that they used to describe this concept? One of the words began with an N, because I know some of you are into the what does it begin with, right? Yes, nullify or nullification. The other one began with an I. Interposition, good. Now, nullify or nullification means to cancel, right? If you nullify something, you've canceled it. You've put an end to it. You've thrown it out. Interposition is, you know, it kind of has the same root as interception, right? It's coming in between. It's intervening as the interposition of the magistrate in quieting sedition. That's Webster's 1828 dictionary. Okay, so it's coming in between, intervening. And so interposition refers to the act of lawfully, a lawful official interceding or coming in between a corrupt official and the people. You know, and a great picture is interception. You know, a person steps in between the quarterback and the receiver and intercepts the ball, right? You know, so with interposition, one person comes in between two factions. Now, in this case, it's two factions that are not inception like the movie, right? Two factions that are in conflict. Now, if you want a great example of interposition, where one person steps in between two people who are in conflict, to that degree, interception's not a good picture because the quarterback and the receiver, at least they shouldn't be in conflict. But interposition does involve with one person stepping in between two people who are in conflict. If you want a great example of something that you're very familiar with, and you've probably already sung about it without realizing it, does anybody know where I'm going with this? Have you ever sung Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing? Jesus sought me when a stranger, wandering from the fold of God. He to rescue me from danger interposed his precious blood. So there you have it. I mean, that's interposition, right? I mean, in Romans, Paul talks about how Jesus is our atonement. He's our propitiation, which put together means he's the sacrifice that turns away God's wrath. I mean, I know in today's world it's kind of politically incorrect in many Christian quarters to talk about God being angry at people, but God is angry at sin. And man, he punishes sin. But if Jesus is your Savior, his blood comes in between, to quote the song, right? I mean, he comes in between a God who is full of wrath against us, and now he is wrathful, but he's also loving. And sometimes we like to just focus on the loving part, and the loving is a great part of it. In fact, that's why he sent Jesus. So the love part is great. It's a good message, and yes, he loves his people, and there is no more wrath. That's the beauty of it. Because Jesus interposed himself, he took the wrath. He took God's anger and punishment, so now he's no longer angry at us. I mean, that's like a really cool message. Great song. But there's the idea, certainly in a way that you've grown up, and maybe you're not used to using the I word, and quite frankly, most pastors that preach the gospel don't use interposed. It can only come from a song that comes from the 1800s, right? I think it's from the 1800s. So anyway, that's interposition in terms of here's an example that we can fully get behind and grasp. In government, interposition refers to one set of government officials coming in between another set of officials and the people. That's what interposition is. But having said that, he doesn't carry a feather pillow. That's right. Realize that what Virginia and Kentucky were doing in interposing, because we're talking about interposition, they didn't actually go all the way to nullifying or canceling the Alien and Sedition Acts. They came just short of that. These two states merely gave the federal government a warning. Virginia and Kentucky basically said that if Congress doesn't repeal these laws, then they will go ahead and nullify these laws. Well, the northern states objected to this. They said there was a problem with Madison's and Jefferson's views on nullifying a federal law. The northern states said that if state officials can cancel a congressional law or a Supreme Court decision, then any state can just ignore the national laws they don't like. In essence, the northern states were saying, look, this could lead to the destruction of the Union. Now, we've been talking about federalism, so with this in mind, can you think of any problems with the arguments that the northern states were making, saying that this is going to lead to chaos? Those of you who like debate, I know some of you are in debate class. Here's your chance. How would you argue against the northern states who are saying, look, if every state can just simply decide which federal laws they like, which they don't, which ones they're going to follow, which ones they're not, how do you even have a union? That's going to lead to chaos. Do they have a great argument? Is that game, set, match? Is that checkmate? Or is there an Achilles heel in their argument? Julie says they were ignoring that in order to nullify, one must prove how it's unconstitutional. Okay, although you could have a situation where you've got state and federal governments both saying, oh, here's why the Constitution says our position is the correct one. I'm saying that could be. I don't know how you could have argued that the Alien and Sedition Acts was constitutional. Mark says, well, it doesn't threaten unity because the law says that you can only disregard laws if they weren't of the Constitution. So, Mark, you're saying basically arguing the Constitution is a unifying factor. So if the states are staking their claim on the Constitution, especially in a situation where maybe the federal government, kind of like that South Carolina congressman, oh, well, there's a lot of things here that aren't based on the Constitution that we're doing. Happening, then it's actually more of a unifying factor to argue the Constitution. So, and I think that's maybe what Julia is saying too as well. Okay, any other thoughts on this? Any other points to make? This is going to lead to chaos, destruction of the Union. Well, here's another one. Yeah, come on, team. Here's another one to consider. Who are the masters in our political system supposed to be anyway? In our political system, isn't it the people of the states who are the creators? The national government is the creature. The states came first. The national government came second. So, the states can say to a large degree, hey, we the boss, right? So they have ultimate authority. When you look at sovereignty, the states are supposed to have more of it, except for the few areas that they've given over some sovereignty. They've given over some authority to the federal government. But remember the play example from the book? Let's say you're in a play, and the play director wants you to act out a lewd scene in the play, and you're not comfortable with this. You go home and tell your parents, boy, if I was a parent of said child who was being, told to act out something, I would be furious. The play director would get a piece of my mind, right? But can you imagine the play director, saying, well, you can't object to this. You've put your child in the play, and this is going to destroy the unity of the play. People can't pick and choose which parts they're going to act out. Is that a good argument to give the parent? Why not? Why is that not a good argument? Why is that not a credible argument? Who ultimately is the authority over children who are still in the home? Yeah, teacher doesn't have the ultimate authority. The teacher has been delegated some authority, right, to run practices, lead the play, give out parts, et cetera, et cetera. But when they cross the line, it's ultimately, and I realize, as high school teenagers, you're getting to the age where you're starting to become more and more independent and take on things. But as long as you're still in the home, I mean, parents are as Chloe says, are like the states. They're the ones with the ultimate authority. They're the masters, quote unquote. I mean, in terms of this illustration. Well, so it's the same thing with the states in our federal system of government, or it should be the same thing. The states are the masters, and they should be able to step in and protect the people from an overbearing federal government. That's what interposition is. But today, people often think that the federal government can just simply do whatever it wants, and the states just have to shut up. That's typically what people's view of federalism. Take healthcare today, or otherwise known as Obamacare. A lot of people in the Obama administration basically say, look, it's the law. Just shut up and follow it because it's the law. Well, that was not Madison and Jefferson's view on unconstitutional laws that are passed at the federal level. They didn't buy the argument that the national unity will be destroyed if states veto unconstitutional laws. They didn't buy that argument, and neither did the American people, because, by the way, who did the American people side with? Did they side with Virginia and Kentucky, or did they side with the northern states? What do you think? Do you remember from the chapter? Let's see. Brooks says the northern states. Mark says they eventually sided with Kentucky and Virginia. Brooks now says, maybe, maybe not. Hannah says the northern states. Chloe says Kentucky and Virginia. Well, remember the Revolution of 1800? What Thomas Jefferson called it, the Revolution of 1800, where angry voters went to the polls and kicked many of the Federalists out of office, including the president, who was of the Federalist Party. So ultimately, the people ended up siding with Virginia and Kentucky. And that election was a political bloodbath for the Federalist Party, which had passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Now, that was one of the things people were upset with. I mean, there was obviously more. There's always more issues than just one. But that was definitely something that many people were really upset with. And so President John Adams, who was the candidate for the Federalist Party, was defeated. And instead of Adams, the people chose a Democrat-Republican named Thomas Jefferson to be president. And so here, interposition, ultimately it was settled by the people. We had what you might call a mild case of interposition, because Virginia and Kentucky were kind of shooting a shot across the bow. But look, this would not be the last time we would see interposition or an attempt at interposition. Certainly wasn't the first time or the last. You saw a lot of examples in Chapter 4. Can you give me some examples? Those are the dates that some major examples of interposition took place. So I've given you that as a memory jogger. Can you think of some of the examples that were in Chapter 4? I like Adams. Does that make it interesting? He was opposed to overbearing authority under monarchy just a few years earlier. And once he was in a hot seat, that was pretty. Yeah, it is. Well, and that gets to the absolute power corrupts absolutely, doesn't it? 1793-5 is the Alien and Sedition Acts. Actually, that was 1798 was the Alien and Sedition Acts in Virginia and Kentucky threatening to veto them. The 1793 to 95 was where the states vetoed a Supreme Court decision by enacting the 11th Amendment. Yeah, that was the Georgia case. And states did not like how the Supreme Court had ruled, and so they overruled the Supreme Court with the 11th Amendment. What were some of the others? 1812, 1828, 1832, 1850s. Good. 1850s would be the Fugitive Slave Act. What else? That was 1820. Southern states, an unconstitutional tariff. And then that was under, actually 1828 was, what was that president? That was the one before John Quincy Adams. Andrew Jackson. That was Andrew Jackson. 1832 then was, wait a minute. Sorry, I reversed it. My president's in order. 1828 was John Quincy Adams. Yeah, thank you. And then Andrew Jackson was the next president, 1832. And that one, South Carolina, actually didn't just threaten, actually vetoed the tariff within his state, or within their state. So that was South Carolina. So there you've got them. And then the War of 1812, that was the last one, where you had several northern states taking steps to nullify the federal government's involvement in the war, like protecting their citizens from the draft. Oh, we also didn't talk about the 1850s with the fugitive slave. Oh, no, or did we? Yeah, we did talk about that. Sorry, Jaylene had that. Okay. So there you have several examples of interposition. Can anybody think of another well-known example of interposition in our history that is not mentioned on the screen? Anybody think of another one? How about, well, that comes much later, Mark. Yeah, that's, and we'll get to this, but that was in the late 1900s, in the 1990s. But I'm thinking even before the ones you see listed on the screen. How about the one that we celebrate every July 4th, the American War for Independence? You know, during 1774 to 1776, you had lawfully elected officials in this country, of course, I should say in the colonies, who were appealing to King George. They were protesting abuses. They were warning, remember we talked about this, that they would be forced to take up arms if abuses continued. And then eventually you had Lexington and Concord, where the Americans did defend themselves against the Redcoats. And do you remember what was the lesson learned from King David and King Saul's life? Can a person ever use defensive force against a king or his officials? Remember what that lesson was? I know one student, when I started saying what was a lesson learned from King David or King Saul's life, he said, don't go to the bathroom in a cave. Yeah, I suppose that's one lesson learned here. But no, the lesson, can a person ever use defensive force, even against a king or his officials? What was the answer to that? Yes or no? We talked about this a couple weeks ago. Has it been that long? only when they're abusing their God-ordained position. Okay. So can a person, so then Julia says yes. Does everybody agree? Person can use defensive force even against the government? Yeah, because if they're acting within their God-ordained position, then there would be no need to act in self-defense. So the point is, well, a lot of you seem timid on answering that question. Now, I thought we nailed that looking at the example of David and Saul. In fact, even like most of you said, yes, it was proper for David to use lethal force, but now you're kind of hesitant to answer the question. Why is that? I'm curious. I mean, 2 weeks ago, y'all were bloodthirsty. Now you're a little bit gun shy. I don't know. Can a person use lethal force against the government in defense? And just okay, you were just chillaxing then. It wasn't that there's confusion or that you're being tepid. Just you were just taking it easy. Okay. Yeah, I just want to. Is Mark speaking for everybody else too? Yeah, you're on board. You just were taking a break from typing. Okay. Remember how the Continentals, we can call them that, applied this at Lexington? Remember, don't fire unless fired upon. They wanted to make sure their actions were defensive, not offensive. And remember, this was in keeping with David's life, with what Samuel Rutherford had said. So they were trying to make sure that everything they were doing was defensive. And this was part one in answering the question, was it biblically justified for the colonies to break with England? We saw that, okay, it was okay for them to defend themselves, right? I mean, look, if somebody is abusing you, whether they have a badge or not, you have the right to defend yourself if your life's in danger. But there was still a part two to this question. Is it okay for states or colonies to withdraw or secede from the Union? Because that's really what the colonists were doing. I mean, that's why we celebrate July 4th, right? Because they actually seceded from Great Britain. Now, before we go any further, I want you to hear from one of the virtual founders of America. And so here we come to our weekly quiz. Now, unlike our quiz from last week, we're going back to everybody answers at the same time. So that means you have to wait to answer. I think last week we did the speed race, but now this week we're back to everybody answers at the same time. So I'm going to put up the question, but then you wait till I count off, okay? So here's the question. Who's been called the virtual founder and great-grandfather of the United States? Was it Christopher Columbus? We just celebrated his special day here a couple weeks ago. Martin Luther, John Calvin, William Bradford. Hopefully you know who all these people are. John Winthrop, George Washington, James Madison, or Samuel Rutherford. All right, now, remember, I'm going to count off to 3, and then we're going to answer together, right? All you have to do is put in the letter. You can put in the last name if you want. So type it in without hitting enter, because I'll count off to 3. You have a wide variety of choices from before there were colonies, while they were colonies, and then after they were colonies. So it's a huge range of choices here. But anyway, here we go. 1, 2, 3, hit enter. Let's see what you got. We've got Christopher Columbus. We have James Madison, John Calvin, a lot of Madison. Very good, a lot of Madisons. I mean, that's not bad, because he's father of the Constitution. Why not, right? But how can you be the father and yet be the great-grandfather? You thought that through. Some said George Washington. Notice there was no I don't know option. Well, if I can have an electronic drum roll, here we go. The correct answer, and some of you did get this, the correct answer is John Calvin. And I don't know that it was all about the beard. Julia, did you picked Winthrop, even though you'd said it was about the beard. It was the beard, right? But wait a minute, John Calvin? Yeah, wait, Abby's like, what? Yeah, seriously. I mean, come on. Everybody now wants to say, wait, what? I mean, he never even set foot in our country. How can he be one of our founders? Well, listen to what some historians have said. The influence of John Calvin's theology, it's all about the theology, is astounding. One historian calls Calvin the virtual founder of America. Another said that if the American statesmen of the 1700s were the founding fathers, okay, people like Washington, Jefferson, Madison, they're the founding fathers, then the Pilgrims and the Puritans were the grandfathers. Okay, that's the Bradfords and the the William Bradfords, the John Winthrops. Okay, they're the grandfathers, and then Calvin was the great-grandfather. See, this is very interesting. Why would secular historians refer to a guy like John Calvin as the virtual founder and great-grandfather of the United States? Because they recognize something. John Calvin was widely read. Remember John Adams' statement that the writings of the Reformation were very influential in that day? See, John Calvin was widely read. His teachings were widely believed in the colonies. And I'm not going to go into all the things that Calvin taught. If you've ever heard of Tulip, you might be familiar with some of this. And actually, we get into a little bit of this in the second semester government class because it actually becomes more of an issue as we look at the presidents. But I do want to talk about one thing that he taught, which applies to our subject right here, the subject of state interposition. And the thing that he taught that applies here is what's known as the doctrine of lesser magistrates. Now, what is the doctrine of lesser magistrates? Well, Calvin described it like this. For when popular magistrates have been appointed to curb the tyranny of kings, so far am I from forbidding these officially to check the undue license of kings. Now, first of all, what is a magistrate? Oh, that is funny. I just saw Julia's question. That's pretty good. Pretty good. I like that. I'll have to share that with my family tonight. Thank you. First of all, what is a magistrate? I mean, in today's world, we think of magistrates as judges. But historically, the term was much broader. Watch out, Brad has. Yeah. Oh, they're full of. They're used to getting puns and things like that from me. Basically, historically, the term magistrate is a civil official. Okay, and so here he's saying when popular doesn't mean like American Idol rock star popular. No, popular means elected. So when elected officials, let me start it this way. When a national leader is breaking the law and endangering the people's liberties, then elected officials, whether they're lower level leaders, whether you call them state officials or lesser magistrates, whatever you refer to them as, they can step in and punish the national leader. That's what Calvin was saying with this doctrine of lesser magistrates. But Calvin wasn't the only one to teach this. You had theologians like Samuel Rutherford, Stephen Junius Brutus, John Knox. So, you had well-known preachers and Christian authors who were advocating the doctrine of lesser magistrates in addition to John Calvin. They taught that when a national leader was breaking the law, the lower-level state officials, the lesser magistrates, could step in and interpose themselves to stop or punish the national leader. Now, some might say, well, that sounds kind of lawless. You can't have the lower level officials doing that. But is that lawless? I mean, sure, there were theologians that were teaching this. But let me ask you this. Do you think they actually got this from the Bible, or were they doing what a lot of theologians do today? Ignore the Bible and come up with their own ideas? Well, that's why, in answer to that question, that's why I asked you to read three passages. 1 Kings, 2 Kings 11, and Judges chapter 3. So let's see how carefully you read them, because I'm going to be asking you questions. Julia says the Reformation also brought forth the idea of being a Berean. Yes, it did, exercising independent thought. not just. And one of the reasons they could do that is because Gutenberg, uh, so with the printing press, was able to put the Bible into so many people's hands where they could actually compare what people were saying or teaching. Now, in regard to the three passages I just mentioned, I'm going to skip for now the 1 Kings 11 and 12 passage. I mean, we'll get to that if we have time. That passage dealt with secession, the 1 Kings 11 and 12, Rehoboam, Jeroboam, all that. It dealt with secession. So remember that passage when you're actually watching the DVD video, the session 6 that's due in 2 weeks. Keep that passage in mind, okay? Because I know secession can be kind of a hot topic. But anyway, let's skip that. Let's go to 2 Kings chapter 11. And basically, I'm just going to give a question per person. And so you can either type in the answer to the question, or you can say, hey, Mr. Pratt, I'd like to answer it on mic, okay? So I'm just going to start at the top of my chat box, or participant list box. I'm going to start with Daniel, go down to Mark, Jaylene, Brooks, Chloe, etc. Okay? So here's the question for Daniel. Daniel, actually for you, do you have a mic? Because it might help to come on mic for this one. Could you give us an overview of what happened in the story with Athaliah? Now, just hang on before I enable your mic, because Mark, I'm going to give you. Well, actually, that doesn't matter. I'll give that to you after we get the overview. So, Daniel, how are you doing today?
I'm doing good.
All right. So, Daniel, could you give us just a brief overview of this story, the 2 Kings 11 story?
Athaliah, is she the evil queen, I believe?
She is the evil queen. Just picture the evil witch from not Cinderella, what's Sleeping Beauty, right? The evil witch. Yeah, well that's Athaliah. Okay, so what about Athaliah?
And so she kills like all of the royal family and stuff, like all the other people that could become heirs, so that she can like rule over the land. And then so I believe it's Jehosheba, who's the daughter of King Joram. She takes Joash, who's the son of Ahaziah, and so she basically takes him and keeps him away because he's one of the people that can become one of the heirs. So she hides him. And then later on, I believe they start like a rebellion or something, and then they come in and then they kill her. I believe she dies at the end.
Okay, and yep, she died at the end. She was executed. All right, now, Daniel, thank you. You've given us an overview. And as you pointed out there at the end, she was put to death. And here's the question for Mark. Was it justifiable for Queen Athaliah to be put to death? And why if you think it was, tell us why. If you think no, it wasn't, tell us why. But was this just a rebellion, against the queen, or was this a proper thing that they did? So, Mark, you can either come on mic, or you can continue perhaps busily typing away to give us... You'll go on mic. Okay, very good. All right, Mark. What do you think?
Okay, you can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, I haven't really analyzed the question completely, but my first kind of gut reaction thought would be that it was the right thing to do. Now, I'm inferring from 2 Kings chapter 11 that she was doing, the wicked queen was doing more than just doing things that were actually outside of the authority of what would be generally accepted as being good for a queen to do. And so just deposing her from her authority was, in my opinion, the right thing to do, but I haven't thought it through as far as like killing her, if that was the right thing to do.
Okay.
However,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Okay, if there's a time limit, tell me. But the thing off the top of my head would be that maybe it was because she took the life of somebody else.
Okay.
So
Mark heard Julia's whisper from, I don't know, are we talking from across the country? Let's see, Julia, you're in Florida, and Mark, you're in California. So yeah, that was a long whisper indeed. So yeah, she had committed capital crimes. So you could look at this as this is justice being served, right? Although you hear the hesitation in Mark's voice. I mean, by nature, we are hesitant to say, yeah, grabbing a government official and slaying them is the right thing to do. However, she had acted quite egregiously. So to help maybe further drill down on this a little bit more, let me go to the next person, Jaylene. Jaylene, and it's not necessarily a review question from the whole semester. Punish murder. Who has the authority to punish murder? How would you answer that, Jaylene, if you were to get into a discussion with somebody about that? Who should punish murder? Jaylene? Hopefully Jaylene is there and is typing. So could it be that Jaylene is going to get a snack to avoid a heart attack? Or perhaps she called for a Big Mac. I know, stop rhyming and I mean it. Go ahead, I'll give somebody else the next line. Let's see, should we pop in on Jaylene? Hey Jaylene, are you there? Wait, nothing. Oh, I do hear typing. So Jaylene is probably typing us something long. Signs of life. Okay, why don't you hit enter and let us see what you've got so far. Because otherwise I'll probably have to go to the next person. Lest this take so long. Even if it's mid-sentence, yes. Who has the authority to punish murder? All right, I'll give the question to Brooks. Brooks, how would you answer that? On mic. Okay, very good. There you go. Hey, Brooks. Look, go ahead. Brooks, you there? Your mic is, and we may have been having some problems with Jaylene's mic because I see Jaylene popped out and popped back in. Silence. Oh, no problem, Jaylene. We were having fun rhyming. I mean, it did give us an opportunity for creativity. Wow. Okay, so Brooks is... Okay, well, let's try Jaylene. Hey, Jaylene.
Hello?
Hey, all right, we got you. Now that we have you, glad that you're back and everything is unjammed. We'll probably lose Brooks because looks like his thing was jammed. Anyway, Jaylene, how would you answer that question? Who has authority to punish murder?
Based on the section we read?
No, I would say just as a review of our government class, who has the, because it's not per se stated in the passage that we have on the screen, but just generally speaking, if you were having a discussion with somebody, who would you say has the power to punish murder? I mean, hopefully we're not this far into the semester that would be a tough question. How would you answer that?
I would say that the, hold on. I would say that the state has the right, the government has the right to punish murderers, if you believe that capital punishment is even correct.
Okay, and what passage would you use to explain your reasoning on that? If you were talking to a Christian.
Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds human blood, by human shall his blood be shed.
Very good. Okay, thanks, Jaylene. That's a good one. I would say there's two that you could go to. And Genesis 9:6 is where it starts, so very good. And then, I took us backwards, didn't I? Sorry about that, folks. Let me advance here. How'd that happen? Dun, 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 dun. Okay, there we are. And then Romans 13 is a New Testament passage which speaks to this. Notice, talking about the civil magistrate, he does not bear the sword for nothing. He is God's servant, an agent of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. So yeah, government has the authority to bear the sword. And what does the power of the sword mean? Well, again, it means the power of life and death. And that speaks to the Genesis 9 passage that Jaylene brought up, that, hey, now man can be put to death for things like murder. Now, the question is, well, who put Athaliah to death? Was this done under authority? Well, notice in the passage it says that it was the commanders of hundreds, commanders of units of 100, verse 15, that put her to death. So yes, it was done under authority, but who are these commanders? I mean, was this just a military coup? Well, let's look at when these officials got their start. And for that, we got to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 1. Deuteronomy chapter 1, you see it on the screen there. Moses, speaking to the people, says, choose or elect some wise, understanding, and respected men from each of your tribes, and I will set them over you. You answered me. What you propose to do is good. So I took the leading men of your tribes, okay, this is after they've been elected, wise and respected men, and appointed them to have authority over you as, here we go, commanders of thousands, of hundreds, ding, 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 of 50s and of 10s, and as tribal officials. Notice, by the way, a couple things here in this passage. This is a tremendous passage. You see elections here in this passage. You see that government is decentralized. How decentralized? They even had commanders over tens. Now that could be over every 10 people or over every 10 families. Theologians like to debate that. However, whatever you agree to as an answer, that is decentralized. I mean, in our country, I don't think anywhere you have a ruler even over every, or official over every 10 families. But, you know, just taking it as it's written, could be over every 1,000 people, 100, 50, 10 people, and of course you have tribal officials. But notice there in the middle, you've got commanders of hundreds. So bottom line, what happened here? Well, tribal or local leaders who have God-given authority, these are the commanders of hundreds, put Athaliah, a murderer, to death. So in the context of biblical Israel, this was done under authority. So that's an interesting point, Julia, about it being the equivalent of a centurion. I'd never thought of it that way. But yeah, this is being done under authority. Any other comments or questions on that? Mark says the representatives rebelled against the federal government. That's one way to look at it, Mark, although to be fair, I think it would be more appropriate to say the Queen rebelled against proper authority, and so the representatives of the people were restoring proper government, or were restoring proper authority. So that way it makes her the rebel and not the good guys be the rebel. But this is a great example in the Bible of interposition. And boy, if you thought this one was good, you gotta love Judges 3, right? Oh, this is the one the guys love and the girls hate. So let's see, we'd gone down to Chloe. Chloe, Yours is the next question. Who was Eglon in this story? And Abby, if you would tell us who was Ehud. Tell us who he was and what his job was. So Chloe, who was Eglon? And Abby, who was Ehud? Hopefully you both are not reading this for the first time now. Let's see. Eglon, he was the king and had power over the country. Okay, Eglon was the king specifically of Moab, but yes, he was now king exercising authority over Israel. He was part of the judgment over Israel. And what about Ehud? As we'll see with Eglon, he was kind of like a Jabba the Hutt, wasn't he? Not exactly poster boy for CrossFit. The left-handed man. Was he like the six-fingered man in Princess Bride? Yes, the left-handed man who was a godsend to relieve the people. Any of you want to be Ehud for Halloween? I am Ehud. You killed my father. Prepare to die. So what did Ehud do? What was it he did? I mean, girls, don't you think he was kind of the emotional, touchy, that Eglon, while, let's see, Hannah, you actually should have the question, what did Ehud do? So while you're typing that, just thinking about Eglon, the Jabba the Hutt guy. I mean, that's maybe a little bit harsh. I mean, because wasn't he a touchy-feely kind of king? Don't you think? I mean, don't you get that from the story? I mean, he did spill his guts to Ehud. It was so intense. You never read this part before. That's so funny. So, okay, so Hannah, what did he do? Just in brief. Actually, we've kind of already spelled it out, or spilled it out, right? Killed the king. Yes, he killed the king. Very craftily as well. Probably a good reason why he was left-handed, because they probably would have checked him, patted him down, assuming he was a right-hander, but being a left-hander, he appears to have been able to smuggle the assassin's sword in. Now, let me give this to, let's see, because next we come to Julia. Oh, Julia, you're probably happy to get this one. But you're the lucky one, because you get the controversial question. And the controversial question is this, and you can come on, Mike, if you want. Was Ehud right in doing what he did? Was Ehud right or justified in doing what he did? And you now have the mic. What do you think? I mean, this is pretty radical.
Right. Well, but does it not say that Ehud was brought up as a deliverer for the Israelites?
Well, indeed, the passage does say that. Yes.
Well,
and not only was he a deliverer, and so, Julia, I think that's a great answer. He was the deliverer, and notice it, he was the deliverer that was the answer to their prayer, right? In verse 15, the Israelites cried out to the Lord, and he gave them a deliverer. So he's an answer to the prayer. So, a lot of people, still might scratch their head, but still something doesn't feel right about this. I mean, he's an assassin. I mean, Eglon's, the king. I've seen this story debated in Sunday school. And typically what happens is that it's viewed outside of the biblical context that we've just looked at. And what was the biblical context that we just looked at? Well, the Bible says that the power of the sword is put into the hands of government, right? And Ehud was a government official. I mean, any commentator you read says that Ehud was a judge. I mean, I know, it says he's a deliverer, but look, this is the book of Judges. Every commentator points out he was a judge. He's a government official. And finally, you do have, so number one, the people pray and God gives them a deliverer. His name is Ehud. Number two, a judge in this day and age, and that you see this in the book of Judges, they have the power of the sword. Okay, that is a power that they have. You see that with Deborah and other judges. So that's the power that they have. Finally, Ehud says, I have a message from God for you, O king. Bye-bye. Yeah. Now, arguably, it's true that somebody might say they're doing something in God's name and be doing something very wicked. But having said that, every indication we have here is that when Ehud to the fact that the Bible is sanctioning what Ehud did. So Julia says a picture of how God moved the Moabites in a position of oppression over Israel, right, and that was their punishment. And then God ordained an ordination. Boy, that's redundant, right? In order to displace an ordination that he had put in place when his people, that's a good alliteration, when his people displaced the ordination that he had ordained. Nicely said. So understand this, and this gets to what Julia was saying in her oh so clever way. The Bible is not sanctioning a massive uprising where people go nuts and execute their leaders. This is not a Beauty and the Beast type uprising, right? Where they storm the castle, kill the beast, right? This is not what's happening here. What the Bible lays out here is the doctrine of lesser magistrates. Of course, it doesn't use that term. That's Calvin's terms. But the doctrine of lesser magistrates, where lower level government leaders can rein in or punish higher level officials. And notice what our founders said in the Declaration of Independence. This is the point that they make. We therefore, the representatives, right? These are magistrates. These are representatives of the people of the United States of America and General Congress, assembled appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by authority of the good people of these colonies. So they are speaking on behalf of the people. They are interposing themselves. This is the doctrine of lesser magistrates at work. Sierra says this is similar to asking if it was justified for Israel to kill thousands, even women and children in the Bible. It is debated a lot, but ultimately God commanded Israel to do it, so therefore it is justified by God. Yes. Now, what's interesting about this, and the only difference to the example you bring up, Sierra, is that 99.9% or probably 100% of the Orthodox Church will say, but the wiping out of a nation like they did to the Canaanites is not a universal decree or example for other nations to follow. However, with this, you do have a lot of Christians who point to this and say this is a proper example to follow, because here we see the example of a government official at work, the doctrine of lesser magistrates at work. So that would be the only difference. Well, good point in what you're making, Sierra, but this is an especially important question because we're asking, so is this a good example for us today? So, by the way, I should have kept reading in the Declaration. They solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. So there you have it. That is secession right there. They have seceded from Great Britain. Just like the commanders of hundreds who killed Athaliah, they were elected. So were the representatives who declared our independence. Basically, the colonists seceded, but they did it in an orderly way. They did it in a way that recognized proper authority. They did it in the name of the people, elected by the people. They were implementing biblical principles. You know, rather than watching Colonial Idol every week or Glee or whatever show was on during the days of the founders. Okay, I know that's a little bit of an anachronism. They were studying books from Calvin, Rutherford, and other Reformed writers. And you see this reflected in their official documents. It infused their thinking. And what a difference from other people and other societies that weren't based upon Christianity and weren't reading these authors and didn't have Christian thinking guiding their actions. For example, what a difference from the French Revolution. Anybody familiar with the French Revolution? I know you've all seen Les Mis, right? Well, but that doesn't really give you a picture of the French Revolution. The French Revolution happened a few years later. It was anything but orderly. Oh, is A Tale of Two Cities that the best of times, worst of times? Yeah, I guess I knew that and had forgotten that. So you guys are taking literature, things like that. Yeah, you hear people. Was a few years after. They've certainly not done. Major difference you see when Christians are not in authority. Let me give you an overview. Okay. Here you've got a picture of the Bastille, or drawing, I guess you would say. In Paris during the 1700s, the Bastille was King Louis XVI's prison for aristocrats. Well, when the king refused to give the people representative government, somewhere along the line of 5,000 to 8,000 people looted an armory and marched on the Bastille. They overwhelmed the prison and surprisingly only found 7 prisoners inside. I think they expected to find a lot more. Soon afterwards, what has become known as the Reign of Terror was unleashed. And who came to power was Maximilien Robespierre, right? Who plunged France into even more bloodshed than before. The guillotine was kept busier than ever as thousands of people were denounced as anti-revolutionary traitors. You know, it is believed that more than 40,000 people died during the Reign of Terror, and it was horrid because at their trials, they could not speak in their own defense. And the victims were the clergy, the aristocracy, the common people. Anybody who disagreed with the revolutionary government was considered a threat to the republic. And the religion driving the Reign of Terror in France was much different than the one in the colonies. During the French Revolution, Christianity was actually banned for a while. The church had its property confiscated. I mean, they even imposed a 10-day work week to get away from the 7-day work week. You had legislation that tried to subordinate the clergy to the state, making them state employees. And the years that followed saw violent repression of the clergy, including the imprisonment and massacre of priests throughout France. So it was particularly brutal, hardly a godly revolution. Robespierre even ended up executing some of his fellow leaders, right? Fortunately for France, Robespierre and his cronies were overthrown in the coup de Thermidor. I'm probably hacking that. But anyway, that was in 1794, and Robespierre was executed facing upwards on the guillotine. How gross is that, right? Upwards of 40% of the priests. I didn't realize that. Wow, that's incredible. That is just horrific. But you know, that gives you a brief glimpse of what can happen when you don't have God's word guiding your actions. Now, this is not to say that King Louis XVI was a nice guy. I mean, he was your typical monarch. He didn't go to bed thinking about how he could better preserve the rights of the people. Okay? But notice the difference. The war for independence in the United States is noted for the fact that there was very little violence against people who were opposed to the war. Very little violence against them, and about a third of the people in the colonies opposed the war. So there was a lot of people that might have been viewed as traitors, but very little violence against them. But during the French Revolution, if you were an enemy of the revolution, they just kept the guillotines going day and night. I mean, it got to the point, and when you read the history, it's kind of gruesome. Sometimes the blade would get dull from so many executions, and some people, it took 2 or 3 whacks to finally get their heads severed. I mean, how horrid would that be? Like, whoop, didn't have a clean, try it again. I mean, it's not funny. I mean, it's awful. They would kill you just for speaking out against the revolutionary government, and then you couldn't speak in your own defense. So notice the difference in the biblical examples that you saw. It's not just a mass of people rioting like you see in the news in some countries, or like how you saw here in France during the French Revolution. Again, it's not the Beauty and the Beast type of storm the castle revolution. No, it's done under authority. It's lower level government officials who have the power of the sword that are leading the charge. And see, that's what the Bible teaches. That's what the Reformation theologians taught, and that's what the founders believed, was that state officials who have the authority of bearing the sword can punish or rein in national officials who are breaking the law. That's what the rule of law is. Nobody is above the law. No one. And so that's why, and I told you it was going to take a few weeks to really drill down and settle this answer, but this is why we can celebrate July 4th in good conscience, because it was done under proper authority. It was done following biblical principles and what Christian theologians were teaching, the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. It was a defensive war. I mean, and you see this in the Declaration of Independence. They're appealing to God for the rectitude of their intentions. Isn't it interesting how man-fueled revolution by humanists like that of the French results in such great loss of human life? Absolutely. Yeah, that's what happens when we depart from God's word and God's principles. There are tremendous consequences. So any questions on all this? I mean, I know we've kind of had a long build-up, spent 3 weeks on answering this, the July 4th question. But hopefully you understand the difference between the authority an individual has versus the authority a state government has, right? I mean, there is a difference. And we've looked at some historical examples from our country. We've looked at some of the biblical principles, stars and stripes forever. But what about today? Does this happen anymore? This state interposition? Well, actually, you read about some examples, right? In the book on page 67, you should have read about what Justice Roy Moore went through in the late 90s. Remember what he was ordered to do? Who's our next person? Sarah from Down Under. What was Judge Roy Moore ordered to do? And remove the plaque of the Ten Commandments. Exactly right. But then Governor Fob James basically was ready to nullify the federal order, wasn't he? In fact, when the federal judge in Alabama said, pull it down, Fob James said, don't worry, Judge, I've got this covered. And he made it to the front of World Magazine as a result. He said he'd call out the National Guard and the police to protect those 10 Commandments. And guess what? The 10 Commandments never came down. By the way, Fob James, this is a great example of what one person can do. And Fob James is a devout believer. In fact, he's kind of a cool history. There's Fob James in the 1950s. He was an All-American halfback for the University of Auburn. He went on to play professional football in Canada, and he was a Democrat. Yeah, in 1978, he ran as a born-again Democrat in Alabama, because in Alabama back in those days, you just couldn't get elected as a Republican. And so he ran as a born-again Democrat, and he became governor. And as governor, he did a lot of good things. He slashed spending. He integrated the government in Alabama. In other words, breaking down barriers that kept blacks out of a very white government. So he was anti-racist. War Eagle, right? Or Tigers, right? One of the few universities with two mascots. He signed legislation letting teachers pray. The Supreme Court had said it was illegal in 1963. He signed legislation letting teachers pray, and he was very critical of evolution. Liberals look at him as a wacko bird, because he's for creation, he's for prayer. But perhaps his ultimate achievement came when he drew the line and he interposed himself to keep that plaque of the Ten Commandments on the wall. See, that's what one person can do when he understands his constitutional authority, when he realizes what God has called him to do. And that's what happened in Alabama. Now, let me give you an example, and you didn't read about this, from Montana. Montana's been a real leader in this regard. I'm really going to have to move quickly through this because we're running out of time. But I want to give you 3 examples from the state known as Big Sky Country. That's Montana. So first we'll start off with a mild case, what I called a mild case of interposition. Congress enacted a ban on carrying guns in schools in 1996. It's a ban that says a person cannot carry a gun on campus unless they have a concealed carry permit. This was actually before Columbine that Congress passed this. So, and hopefully you like that picture from High School Musical there, right? Anyway, Columbine was 1999. Obviously, that ban has not stopped bad guys from carrying guns onto school grounds. Evidence Columbine. They ignored the ban, right? So that's the Columbine picture there on the left. That's the whole point there. The law has not stopped people from taking guns to kill people on campus. Now, the guy you see on the right, his name is Joel Myrick. He's an assistant principal, or was at the time, the assistant principal of the high school, Pearl, Mississippi High School. So his role in a 1997 shooting was really interesting. He disobeyed the ban because he ran to his car when there was a schoolyard shooting. He grabbed the gun out of his truck. He ran back to where the shooting was coming from, found the kid, pointed his gun at him, and stopped him in his tracks. I mean, this principal, assistant principal, saved countless lives doing that. Well, Montana decided to side with the Myrick approach. The state passed a law 1 year after the Congress had passed this ban. So this is 1997, and they said if you're not a criminal and you're an adult, you are automatically deemed as having gotten a permit, a concealed carry permit, to comply with the law. Follow what that's saying? You may not have a concealed carry permit. Doesn't matter. If you're a law-abiding person, you're not a criminal, you're an adult, you are hereby deemed as having a permit whenever you go onto a school grounds. Therefore, you can carry a gun on school grounds. So what that means is now any decent citizen, a teacher, a parent, a principal living in Montana can take his gun on the school grounds even if they technically don't have a permit. In essence, the state used a loophole in the federal law to get around the federal law. That's why I call it a mild case of interposition. By the way, Montana has not had a school shooting since then. Go figure. That's probably because, criminals would think it would be stupid because there will be teachers and principals who are armed. Now, let's take a look at a stronger case of interposition. In 2005, the Congress passed what opponents have called a national ID law. Basically, it requires every state to do its driver's licenses the same way, putting the same information on them. Once again, the federal government telling the states what to do. Well, to make things worse, you wouldn't be able to get on a plane or enter a federal building if you don't own one of these national ID cards. And people have compared it, said it's somewhat reminiscent of Nazi Germany, where you couldn't travel unless you had your papers with you, right? Well, anyway, these national IDs, which would have RFID chips in them, okay, and if you know anything about RFID chips, that allows to have your movements tracked and recorded. So that's another reason why people didn't like this. But anyway, these national ID cards, as people were calling them, can implant the RFID chips with all kinds of personal information on them. So for all these reasons, you know, no authority, people can track you, can put all kinds of personal information on, all these reasons, people oppose this. Well, Montana, along with about half the states, passed laws that simply said we are not going to obey this federal law. This law does not apply in our state. Literally half the states passed laws like this. So by the time President Obama took office in 2008, his administration, looking at half the nation, half the states not enforcing this law, he said they would not enforce this federal law because too many states were not in compliance. So basically, these states used nullification to kill an unconstitutional federal law, the Real ID Act, or affectionately known by its opponents as the National ID Card Act. All right, let me give you a stronger case, super duper strong case of interposition from the state of Montana. This was Montana's reaction to the D.C. gun ban. In January of 2008, the Bush administration, when the D.C. gun ban was going all the way up to the Supreme Court, the Bush administration took a position in favor of the D.C. gun ban. That surprised a lot of Republican supporters. They were actually supporting the D.C. gun ban. Well, Montana and Montanans were furious. So they went on record saying that if the Supreme Court rules with the Bush administration and against the Second Amendment, in other words, if the Supreme Court rules in favor of gun control, they would be forced to discuss whether they would even stay in the United States. They were talking about secession. This was widespread being discussed. There were government leaders that were signing petitions and things like that. Well, in June 2008, the Supreme Court ruled against Washington, D.C., ruled against the Bush administration, ruled against gun control. So all talk of secession out of Montana ended. But there you see the URLs, if you can take a screenshot of that if you want to read up on any of those stories. You know, Montana has been a leader when it comes to state interposition. You know, they were one of the first states to pass what's known as a Firearms Freedom Act, and I'll have to do this real quickly, but basically it says that if a gun is manufactured in the state and stays in the state, then it's exempt from most federal gun laws. And so there you see 8 other states have followed Montana's lead. Those are the green states, so 9 states in all. But this is state interposition in action. You know, they're saying that, hey, federal gun control doesn't apply if the gun is made in the state and stays in the state. But these examples are just the tip of the iceberg. There's many other examples from our recent history that I could have shown you. But again, this just shows that the people of the states are the masters. And so the states can veto unconstitutional laws in their states. But what happens if the federal government says it's constitutional and the states disagree? Well, you see in your homework what the founders said. In short, they said that the master decides, not the servant, right? When there's a conflict over what the Constitution says, it's the one with the most authority. It's the sovereign. Let's face it, when there's a disagreement between parents and kids, who ultimately has the final authority and has the trump card? It's the parents, right? Well, it's the same with the states and the federal government, and it was the same in our conflict with Great Britain. Elected representatives interposed themselves between the king and the people and declared that that we were seceding from the king. They declared that we were seceding from the king. You had lower level magistrates seceding, and then we defended ourselves when the king's agents attacked us. So it was the same in our conflict with Great Britain, and that's what we have going on today with state interposition taking place in a lot of different states. All right, I'm going to call it quits there. Sorry, we're 2 minutes over. Anything else? Any questions on what we talked about? Any questions on the homework? Any other questions? All right then. All right. Well, there you see what is due next week. Of course, there's the long range things that are due. Do I have them here? Yep, those are the longer range things. So keep those in mind, and we will see you next week, right? All right, guys. Everybody take care. Sorry I had to rush there at the end, but we were running out of time. All right. Oh, yes. Don't forget, do it now. Email your thank you for the reminder. Email your picture to Julia. Do it right now, folks, so you don't remember. All right. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.